We've got a great set of presenters today that I'm really excited to get to. But I just wanted to give a brief background on National Civic League and the All-America City Award before we get started. So I'm Sarah Lipscomb, the director of the All-America City Award Program and Community Assistance Program here at the National Civic League. And National Civic League is a 123-year-old nonprofit that aims to create inclusive, thriving communities by inspiring, supporting, and recognizing equitable approaches to community decision-making. And as many of you know, the All-America City Award is our flagship program. It has been around since 1949 to recognize 10 exceptional local governments and civic engagements. And not only does the All-America City Award celebrate the great work that's happening in civic engagement around the country, but also really aims to share those innovative practices so that they can be adapted in communities around the country. So we have started this monthly webinar series to accomplish just that. So it is NCL's hope to accelerate the pace of change in communities across the country by equipping individuals, institutions, and local governments with the ideas and models and insights needed to do inclusive civic engagement in your own communities. So I wanted to very briefly go over the 2018 and 2017 All-America City Awards. Just so you all have a little bit of background before we dive into the presenters. So for 2017, as many of you know, it is in partnership with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. And this is a follow-up to our 2012 partnership. So it will look a little bit different than our typical All-America City. And the application for that one has already closed. But for 2018, we're very excited. We just launched the application last week. And we are spotlighting projects that promote equity through inclusive civic engagement. And you can download that application right now on our website. It has all of the dates, the guidelines, criteria, and everything that you need to know to apply. And I'm always available, phone, email, and I'll go ahead and send my contact information in the follow-up. But just want to give you all some time to go through that application, and feel free to call or email me with any questions. Just so you know, if you haven't applied for All-America City Award before, this is your first time being introduced to the program, don't get too worried when you do download the application. It's meant to be difficult. The good news is you have a full year before the 2018 application is due. But we really view the application as a way to do civic engagement in your community. It allows you to bring together all different kinds of individuals and groups, learn about new projects and programs that are happening. So we see the application as a tool of engagement itself. And again, you can download that now on our website for 2018. So enough about All-America City and National Civic League. I really want to make sure we have a lot of time from our presenters, who we have from Seattle, Dubuque, and Lakewood. And we purposely chose these three communities to kind of represent a wide range of approaches to inclusive civic engagement. We have Seattle, whose specific focus is on institutional racism barriers to engagement, and really how to mitigate those. We've got Dubuque, who's a 3-time All-America City winner, who's fostering a culture of engagement within the city to be emanated throughout all projects within the community. And then finally, we'll have Lakewood, who is a 2-time All-America City winner, who will present on Lakewood Linked, and is really a way that they use their convening role in engagement to bring together residents and really leverage their expertise in getting things accomplished together. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our first presenter, who is Teddy McGlynn from the city of Seattle, Washington. So Teddy, if you go ahead and unmute yourself and present. Teddy, are you there? Can you hear us, Teddy? Give us one moment. I'm going to go ahead and unmute everyone.
Great. So I can hear you. So it just told me that I was unmuted.
Okay, perfect. Teddy, we can hear you.
Great. Sorry,
if everyone else, could go ahead and mute themselves while we listen to Teddy. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks. Sorry, I didn't know what the, even though we got on early, I still didn't know what the muting situation was going to be. So thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me. My name is Teddy McGlynn-Wright, and I work as a strategic advisor for Seattle's Race and Social Justice Initiative here in the Office for Civil Rights. So today I'm going to talk about kind of three big chunks. I'll start with an overview of kind of our RSJI and some of our accomplishments over the last about 12 years that we've been kind of in effect. And I'll talk about kind of one of our kind of prime movers of institutional equity, which is this racial equity toolkit, which I think you all will have access to or will have access to. And then the last piece really is to talk about kind of the combination of those two things, or culmination of those two things, which is this Seattle 2035, our kind of new comprehensive plan, what we affectionately refer to as the COMP plan or Seattle 2035, and how much that's been influenced by our racial equity analysis. And so that's a little bit of where the rubber hits the road in terms of thinking about future planning. And I want to make sure that we have time for folks to ask questions. So, I'll be moving pretty quickly, and my hope is that if I do, that you're, taking notes or whatever, that you're able to follow up on anything that I mentioned that I kind of move a little bit too quickly over. So, to start off with, so the Race and Social Justice Initiative was started about 10 years ago, about 3 administrations ago, in the city of Seattle, and I think it's one of the things that is telling to this kind of work, where it can actually survive multiple transitions of mayoral transitions. I think that a lot of cities, as you can imagine, have, when the executive turns over, a lot of things can kind of fall out of that. So the fact that this initiative, housed in the Office of Civil Rights, has survived that long, I think is telling. It was initially in the mayor's office, and then got moved to the Office of Civil Rights, and it came about from pressure inside, from city employees around institutional racism, and then some really strong pressure from the outside of anti-racist organized communities of color, primarily pushing against the city to say, hey, we need you all to do your business in a way that's more equitable. So, kind of the quick rundown of some of the accomplishments of the last 10 years, other than our continued survival and staffing up, frankly, is that our most recent mayor last year signed an order saying that each department was actually going to have to run 4 racial equity toolkits on any policies or practices that they wanted to, but they would have to run these 4 toolkits, every department, and report on them, frankly. So that, while it's been a little bit of kind of a goodwill indication earlier than this, this is the first time a sitting mayor has actually said, no, you actually need to do these. And one of the things that allowed us to do from our office is sit with departments who had run their racial equity toolkits and have what we refer to as RET seminars with each department to sit down and say, like, here's where you were really successful in your racial equity analysis and running this toolkit for the places where you could have been better. Let's think forward and figure out kind of what's next. And those toolkits have been run on kind of a range of things, from huge projects about substations and where to kind of put things in that direction, capital projects, all the way down to how folks were going to share office space in a particular department. So it's a really versatile tool, and we love it. So each department has to do 4 of those, and they get reviewed. So the other piece is that some of the places where we run our racial equity toolkit is on a utility discount program, so programs that are specifically targeted toward folks who are on the lower side of the income spectrum and need support with paying their utilities, their light bills. It's also been run on 2035 comprehensive plan and really led into this equitable development conversation, which is really kind of bursting right now. it's also resulted in really a real shift in our community engagement, and that's been one of the biggest things that I've noticed as a resident of the city, and then also as a city worker, is that our approach to community engagement really shifted. There was a long period of time where folks were primarily doing some surveys, some focus groups, and then these district councils or some of these kind of smaller little organized groups would have undue influence in terms of city policy and city planning. And what's really shifted is that our department's commitment to doing effective outreach and engagement and really saying the folks who are most impacted by this change, by this policy, by this building, by this capital project, by this program, need to be at the center of determining what that program, policy, capital project, or what have you is going to be. And so, to the best of our ability, and sometimes it's hard, right? Like getting with community to say, here's this thing that we're thinking about, here's the thing we want to plan, and really listening to community and really taking leadership from community and trying to build that together in a partnership way, rather than saying, hey, we're the city and we have some ideas, and so we're going to deliver this project to you, right? Which is a method of engagement, to listen to community and then say, okay, I think we have a nice idea of what your problem is. Here's how we're going to deliver this solution, right? And leaning more into a process where we're saying, hey, community, like, what do you see as the problems in your community? What are the things that you are already doing to address those problems? And how can we either support those efforts or get out of the way when we're in the way? So one of the central tenets of institutional racism is recognizing that while many individuals in the city may not be racist, as an institution, we are. And so our strategies are really about how do we mitigate and minimize racist outcomes, and how do we increase equity in that process? What do we have to do to remove barriers that we have put in place? So those are some of the kind of big picture gains that we've made, so shifts in our kind of methods and strategies of engagement, and then also really landing on doing racial equity toolkits and getting people some really good practice at setting racial equity outcomes and shifting their engagement strategies and bringing in different kinds of data from stakeholders. Some of the other kind of fun things that we do, one of the big projects that I work on is called Core Team, and that's an internal team of folks in the city who go through this year-long this year-long racial justice and leadership development program, as well as a 6-month practicum project that they all do. And we're actually about to launch the Core Team 5 in a couple of weeks, so I'm really in that at this moment. I actually have a meeting about that this afternoon, and excited about it. And it's citywide, but we take a really small group to really move them through this transformative experience, which includes kind of day-long training seminar work, and then also kind of national speakers who come, and then individual or small group projects that folks are doing around to move equity forward, and then really lifting up people's ability to do their own leadership development, as particularly in the realm of racial justice. So one other thing that I have been told to mention is, or two other pieces that are kind of structural. So we talk a lot about when we're doing institutional change, we're trying to institutionalize equity. We need to figure out, like, what are the structures that can make that happen. So we have an RSJI, a Race and Social Justice Initiative sub-cabinet, which is kind of leadership and from across the city who get together monthly to move racial equity forward in that way. We have change teams. So in each department has a change team. Usually they're between about 10 and 20 folks, and they're kind of the local experts on racial equity and on their department, right? And we support them through liaisons in our office. And then the Directors Forum, which is a quarterly meeting that we have with just directors, no substitutions, to really talk about what equity looks like and what racial justice looks like at that level. So those are some of the structures that we have around moving racial equity forward and that the RSJI team leads. So just checking my time here to make sure that I'm all right. We're halfway through. Cool. So this big next piece, and you'll get some. I'm going to send some documents out to you all after the call, or I'm going to send them to Sarah, and then after the call you'll get those as well. So there's kind of the Seattle 2035 equity analysis. So again, kind of the thinking about municipal governments and how they're related, right? So we have a Growth Management Act at the state level that really is about how do we make sure that we don't sprawl. And so every 20 years we have to have this comprehensive plan about how we're going to grow but not sprawl out. And so Seattle, through some internal organizing, really decided to put in some strong equity measures and some strong equity practices into developing the plan and then to executing the plan. And so what that means is that, so folks on the inside of the city and folks on the outside pressuring the city again, right, to use a racial equity analysis as they were developing this comprehensive plan, so that we're looking at things like displacement, who is going to benefit from development and who is going to get hurt, and that instead of this kind of binder living on a shelf, that it would actually be this like livable, living, breathing document that folks would actually reference and use and use as a guiding tool. And one of the strategies that folks did to make that happen was that, usually, so on this comp plan, you've got folks who are looking at health, you've got folks who are looking at development, you've got folks who are looking at different neighborhoods. And what some of our folks did is that they made sure that each of the planners was coupled with racial equity people. Folks who had racial expertise were coupled with each individual who was writing each section of the comprehensive plan, if that makes sense. So they got together, and then they went out to communities to really start some of that community engagement work to figure out what's going to go into the. That's a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's helpful to think about what it takes to make these things. Someone decided, like, hey, you need to include racial equity, is that folks worked inside and really specifically to make sure that the folks who were developing this comprehensive plan had strong racial equity analyses and also had a strong racial equity team to support them in developing it. So let's see. So I think with the comp plan, there are kind of a few things to really think about, and this flows from our general racial equity toolkit and our general kind of racial equity analysis, is that you want to establish your clear criteria around equity, form the structures that you need to form, and then really integrating equity into the departmental function plans, as well as establishing some sort of monitoring process. So like, talk about what how does equity fit in here? What's your racial equity goal? What are the structures you have to achieve it? How are you going to monitor it? And like make sure that happens, right? So it's not rocket science, but it actually takes some practice and it takes some doing. So the comprehensive plan is a long document, but the racial equity analysis actually, we have a cool summary that I'll send out, and I think it's like 4 or 5 pages. It's really helpful to give a sense of. We looked at displacement risk, so looking at the city, across the city to say, where are the places where folks are most likely to be displaced, where are marginalized folks most likely to be to not be able to live in their homes anymore, whether that's because of rising housing costs or whatever else. And what we found was that so we developed a displacement risk index and an access to opportunity index. And when we overlay those, it helps us understand, like, in these particular communities where folks are already marginalized because of histories of historical redlining or historical displacement or current gentrification and displacement, if you also have these new opportunity structures coming in, which are about high-performing elementary and middle schools, the number of jobs within that kind of walking radius, that it actually exacerbates the displacement risk. And what we need to do is figure out how do we mitigate that displacement risk and really make this a city where everyone can actually live. So we know that we're growing. That's not going to change. How do we make sure that the way that we grow is in a way that allows people who want to live here are able to live here, and the folks who are already living here are able to stay here, and that where you live isn't the thing that is most predictive for how you're going to do or how you're doing, right? So it's not so that race and geography and zip code are not the primary predictors of your health and wellness and education. And it looks like I am wanting to make sure that other folks have time, so I will I'll kind of do a quick continued quick little mini summary. But the idea was really around equitable development, and this equitable development initiative coming out of this racial equity analysis was about creating these healthy, vibrant communities. It includes some of our investments and programs and policies, and there are 3 neighborhoods that have, again, with historical displacement, concentration of folks of color, and redlining that we're going to be focusing on, including the Central District, the Chinatown International District, and then the kind of Rainier Beach area of Seattle. And those are all kind of places that are ripe for investment, and that's really how we're trying to drive some of our strategies, is like, how do we drive investment dollars in those areas, and particularly development and community development. And the Office of Planning and Community Development came out of this racial equity analysis, moving forward to kind of look at our comprehensive plan, to be able to look at, what do we want to be 20 years from now in terms of this city. I don't know. So that was a lot, and it was a lot in a little bit of time, and I want to make sure that folks have time to ask questions about any of those pieces. So I'm going to pause for questions at this point.
Great, thank you, Teddy. Does anyone have any questions at this point? You should be unmuted, so feel free to jump in and ask any questions of Teddy. Well, I have a question for you, Teddy. I'm just so impressed with the work that Seattle has done on this. And I wanted to know if you had any advice for communities who are just beginning this work in a lot of places where racism hasn't really been talked about or discussed. What advice do you have, and what kind of starting point would you give those communities?
Great question. So I think that for places where that conversation is nascent in that way, I think it's helpful for folks. I think there are kind of 2 or 3 things that are helpful. Number one is, have the conversation, right? So like, make sure that it's happening wherever it's happening. I recommend that folks go to where it's happening, right? So in Seattle, there's a history of organized communities of color and organized anti-racist white folks who have been, trying to make institutional change from the community side. And so I think going to those places, going to those organized communities and listening and figuring out kind of what's the collaboration that can emerge from that. And then the third piece, I think, is really knowing your history, right? So like, as a city, knowing what are the things that have led to change in your city? Like, what kind of organizing efforts have led to shifts, big shifts in your city? Because I think that'll give you a sense of what it would take, and what some of those paths to power have been and could be moving forward. And then I think, racial equity toolkit, super simple, just a few questions, and it makes a really big difference. I mean, if you can even just start people asking the question of what's a racial equity outcome here? Who are the folks who are most likely to be impacted? How do we get them at the table? How do we listen to their leadership, right? That's a huge move. It's a huge move.
Hey, this is Nicole. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep, go ahead.
Have any of the tools you've developed or processes been used by any community groups that are addressing gentrification?
Have the tools or processes we've developed and used by communities to address gentrification?
Yeah, have any groups asked for the information you just shared with us to see if they can use it to address gentrification in the community?
Great question. So yes, one of the things, I guess there are kind of 2 answers to that question. So yes, some folks have used that, and we've been able to do some work in that direction. So particularly in the Central District, and I can't remember the name of the group off the top of my head because that's not my area, but they were doing some organizing around investment and development, and wanted to know as that community, which was a historically Black community in Seattle, is in the process of gentrifying. What's the move, and what's the city doing to make that not the thing that happens? How are we preserving culture and place for people? I don't know. I actually don't know what the outcomes of those conversations are. I think that they're kind of they're still happening. The challenge is that gentrification is moving more quickly than some of our policies to mitigate it, right? And so the strategies around, like, how do we support leadership from communities, particularly these organized communities of color, like how do we support their leadership in preserving their communities is tricky because we're like in our own bureaucracy, right? So I think that's been tricky. But we've definitely had some of those conversations and had some of those partnerships and used some of this analysis to direct some city policies, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, can.
Hi, this is Theo Williams from the city of Salisbury, Maryland. I had a question that kind of follows off of that one. How do you ensure that you are avoiding gentrification while also bringing in investment, but that investment doesn't lead to a concentration of poverty, for instance, the use of LAHTCs within an already impoverished neighborhood? Thank you.
Thanks. So it's a balance. So one of the big things that has been both a struggle and a push here, so this piece around equitable development. So it's both about like how do we, so we now have this equitable development fund that's going to funding some of these projects and building affordable housing. So that's one avenue, and then it's also about like how we're growing. Like again, it's this idea that we are growing, and it's about how we're growing. How are we lining up the growth areas with linking them with how are we making sure that folks who are pushed further out of communities, further away from jobs, further away from transit, and into places that are environmentally worse, right? So how do we grow in a way that's socially just and environmentally just? And again, the answer is, we're in it. We're in process. I don't think that there's anyone in Seattle that would say that we stopped gentrification. I think there are a number of people who would say, we're doing some work to make it so that gentrification isn't the driver of everything isn't the driver of growth in Seattle, right? I don't think that we're all the way on the other side to say that like equity is the driver of growth in Seattle, but I think if we're trying to, as a city, when we try to move our resources in that direction, we're just more likely to be successful in a more equitable direction as opposed to if we just, back away and let things kind of run wild. So that's a kind of big answer to that question. I don't know if that really, did that answer your question?
No, thank you. Yeah, that's helpful.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to go ahead and move on to our next speaker, but there will be time for more questions after each speaker and then at the end as we're wrapping up the webinar. So I want to go ahead and introduce Nicola Pavlik from Dubuque, Iowa, and he was the Civic Engagement Coordinator there. So Nicola, we'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you for having me. So yes, I was the former Community Engagement Coordinator for the city of Dubuque in Dubuque, Iowa. I now live in Brooklyn, New York, so a pretty different experience, and I'm loving it so far. So next slide, please. Basically, my position was established in July of 2012 for the city. I was the first person in the position. It was the first position ever, and it was hosted in the Human Rights Department. And so from July 2012 to March 2014, my job was to assemble an internal team of city staff to help me do this change work in the organization, basically. And the change that I was tasked with was to get more diverse community members involved in local government. But we didn't really have shared understanding of what diverse populations meant, what participation in government meant. There's really no trend lines, and people weren't keeping demographic data. So I needed an internal team to help me think this stuff through. And then we did an assessment of the city's current practices as well as in the back 3 years. And then we created a plan that the council needed to approve. So that took about almost less than 2 years. And then from March to December of 2014, so we established a community engagement planning toolkit that I will go into depth here a little more, but it was based on research that I did of Seattle and I did of many other cities who were doing community engagement for a while, and then best practices through research, academic research, et cetera. And then in 2015, we established community engagement measures for every project that had a community engagement plan. We established a set of measures and began to pilot the toolkit we developed. It took about less than a year to develop the toolkit. And then in 2016, we just did it. We piloted the toolkit for 14 projects. 7 were actually finished. And then we established a set of best practices that the staff would evaluate all of our work around engagement at the end of every year. And then every 3 years, the idea was to do an overall assessment. Next slide, please. So what you have in front of you, will have in front of you a bit. The bottom row really talks about the 5 major questions that the toolkit was designed to help staff answer. And each of the questions had a set of tools that if the staff follow and finish, it would give them the answer to that overarching question. The stars that you see that are purple are where we specifically focus on. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Hey, Nicola, we can still hear you. There just seems to be some feedback happening.
Oh. Maybe it's the room I'm in.
All right. Yeah, if you want to keep going, and I'll let you know if it starts happening again.
Okay. Is this okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. So the first 2 questions that you see here are the starred ones, and that's where we focus our attention around diversity, understanding what diversity is per project, and what it meant to be inclusive and equitable with diversity in mind. So if you go to the next slide, this is an example of the tools that we use for that first question. So tool number 1 would ask the staff to name community members that are going to be impacted by this project, and that they need to include, and then also how each of the members that they've identified would want to be involved in this project. And then the second tool, after they do that, would talk about the potential conflicts that might exist between the different groups that they've named, just because we wanted to be cognizant of political power, economic power, language power, other ways that people can either dominate the conversation or have conflict over issues that would make the meetings not productive initially. And then, I mean, the other things that we try to do is give staff an idea of how much time this would take, the cost, etc. But pretty much for all that stuff, they would get in touch with me and I'd help them work through that. If you go to the next slide, for question 2, you can see there are a lot of tools, but the one that I'm going to highlight is tool number 4. Basically, that was my way of integrating other staff from the organization into this process. So we had an outreach coordinator. It was a person who was, went to every community event. Their job was to understand who the groups are in our community that are majority, minority, new, established groups. And really, when I would get statements like, oh, I don't know the answer to this question, or I don't have time to understand the answer to this question, we would work with this staff using tool number 4 to get the answers that staff needed to make sure that their plan that they're putting together is respectful of the diversity that exists, that's going to be impacted by their project. So next slide. Towards the end of the planning process, we focused our energy on, okay, fine, you're going to do a charrette or charades. I never know what the name of it is. You're going to use different techniques to engage the public. Maybe a survey. Maybe you're going to have like an open house. Maybe you're going to play some games out at a park to gather public input. Fine, that's awesome. That's creative. That's great. But how many community members are you going to use this technique with? Do they need any kind of alterations to be able to participate? For example, if people in a wheelchair come, how will they participate? Can you adapt for whoever's coming with the diversity that they're coming, be it language, ability, whatever the case is? And then the second thing we talked about was quality of communication. So how are you going to get the word out to the people that you want to reach who are going to be impacted by your project that they should come and participate, and also who should be doing the reaching out. Do the staff have the relationships, or do you need to be partnering with somebody who has more trust or more powerful relationships than staff do to get the word out? And then if you go to the next slide, this is the tool that we used when staff say, I don't know the answers to your questions, Nicola. I don't know what their relationships are. I don't know what kind of, what they want from my project. I don't know. I don't have the relationships. So this is the tool that we developed that the outreach coordinator and I would help the staff work through. We would find the groups they should meet with, or the outreach coordinator and I would go and meet with them and give them this information. So it was our way of realizing that relationship building and sometimes, honestly, bridge building was a key component to any participation of groups that traditionally felt like the city wasn't listening to them. Because the biggest thing that I noticed is that we think that change can happen by just, establishing a new position. And while I'm very bubbly and likable, I'm told, that only goes along a certain way. So we needed to make sure that the process also called that out and called out the time that it takes to build those relationships and repair relationships. And then if you go to the next slide, this is the tool that we kind of wrap things up with. So after a period of planning, we would go back to this and we would say, okay, are there community members that appear to collaborate together as a group that we want to have be part of this process for this project? Who are they? Are there groups that have trust between each other or don't have trust? Who are they? And then all the way down to who we have so far built connections with during this process. Young people, seniors, people with disabilities, English non-native speakers, etc. And just, again, it's another layer of checking in to see if we're naming the diversity that's important to name or not, and are we actually including it in the process. So that's a quick overview of the community engagement toolkit, just those two questions, and kind of an overview of how the position started and what I was doing in the early years. This slide talks about, so I was there up until July of last year, and was able to participate in piloting this toolkit with 14 projects were assigned to me initially. After doing some assessments and pilots, we realized that only 7 actually were ready and truly were engagement oriented to be piloted with a toolkit. So this is the demographic data based on those 7 projects. And what you'll quickly see is that who we reached were, yes, okay, male and female were pretty close, but then we reached people who were white, had a college degree, and predominantly were either closer to 65 years of age or like in their mid-20s to early 30s. And right, it's one thing for me to say during my job that the techniques, community engagement techniques we're using, how we're planning things will produce this outcome, but it's a different thing to see it in numbers. And so it was a very important thing for me to make sure that every single time we did community engagement, demographic data was collected and staff they felt confident in collecting that data. So next slide, the techniques that we did end up utilizing to increase diverse participation were based on relational outreach. So an example of that, for one project, we partnered with a program that specifically served youth of color, and we asked them if they could move their program an hour later, but we can come during the regularly scheduled time and have youth participate and give us input. And they said yes, so we did that. Same thing with people with disabilities. There was a predominant organization who served people with disabilities in our community, so we partnered with them to host meetings at their location at times that they told us worked for the people that they served. And, that meant that some of our staff needed to work different hours than they did. And so we had to just work through that logistical stuff. We moved meetings away from City Hall. We moved it into a supermarket, community centers, and the library, amongst, like, we had kiosks put around the city for different projects. And then the other thing that we did was we developed quick infographics to share what we heard during public input sessions, what we did with the input, and what the next steps were. And that really, it kind of, I can't tell you how many times participants, after they would receive the document, would come to me or tell another staff who told me that that was one of the biggest positives that we could have done, is that they felt like, okay, I can see what you heard, I can see what you're doing with this information, and I know now what to do next about this if I care about it. And then lastly, we moved away from a microphone type of approach to more of a group dialogue and group preference type of approach to gathering public input. And we for the project we piloted, we needed to do that just because there was no one right answer and nobody agreed on one solution. So people really needed to dialogue with each other and go back and forth with their opinions. And then last slide, this is just an example of the infographics we created for the 7 projects. This is just 2 of them. One is for the city budget for 2017, and the other one was for the Resilient Community Advisory Commission that was being revamped or designed basically for the city. And they're all the same, it's the same template in terms of what content we wanted to present to the public. So there's some repetition, so they would always know what to expect. But we tried to change the color and other things to not make it so boring. So yeah, at this point, I'd like to open up to any questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nicola. Dubuque has been a long part of the All-America City Award program, and it's great to see how far the civic engagement has come there. So I'll ask you a similar question to Teddy's, but what advice would you give to someone who is just beginning this work?
I would say definitely look for best practices that many cities have already established and have in place in terms of a systematic approach to doing community engagement. So that's number 1. Number 2 is create some shared meaning around keywords, like what does community engagement mean for your city, and where do you want the public to be involved? It are very simple questions, but super important and tend to be the hardest to answer. What I just said, those 3 things are pretty much long-term type of long-term work-oriented things. So while you're doing that, I would encourage anybody to do something that's low-hanging fruit that can make a really strong statement about why community engagement is important and why we should invest time and energy and resources in doing it really well. So if you can find a need in your organization or community that can benefit from community engagement and you can get it going, that can give you future data and reasons for why you should do some of this long-term stuff.
Great, thank you. Any other questions?
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, hi Nicola. This is Chris Patterson, one of your former neighbors from down here in Iowa City.
Oh, hi.
And just a quick question. It sounds like most of your work that you were describing there, and this is probably a question for all of the presenters as well, but seems it's very focused on what the city is doing, on their city government. I'm curious because I heard recently of a network up in Dubuque called Inclusive Dubuque, which is a broader network of organizations of which I think the city's a part, but not necessarily the leader. I'm just sort of curious how you would describe the relationship between what you do within the city and maybe some broader efforts to work with a variety of partners to sort of bring a more inclusive culture across a variety of organizations.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Inclusive Dubuque, our city manager asked all the staff to be part of Inclusive Dubuque, and he let us figure out what that meant for us. And so for me, I would work with the core group of Inclusive Dubuque to help them think about what does engagement mean and for their initiative. And I would give them the tools and some of the things that we developed for them to use and test out in a community setting. And then the other part that staff did too was we would be liaisons between city resources that could be leveraged to meet community needs once they were discovered, as well as remind the network of the existing processes that are in place to meet the community needs, and just kind of bring awareness and at the same time improvement of those processes that the city had to meet those community needs.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Chris, that was a great question, and I think will lead really well into our next presenter, who is Mary Ruther from Lakewood, Colorado. And their presentation focuses on more how residents work together and how the city can be a convener for types of engagement projects. So Mary, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. So again, I'm Mary Ruther with City of Lakewood in Colorado, and my title is Strategic Initiatives Manager. I'm going to talk to you about the Mayor's Lakewood Linked Initiative, which was introduced as a concept in 2013 and began implementation in 2014. We've had some really great success with this, so I'm real happy to share this. The initiative, which formalized a community engagement process for us, for Lakewood, was really the idea of a former mayor, Bob Murphy, that we had, and it's been carried forward by our current mayor, Adam Paul. The question was, how can the city actively encourage and support engagement within our neighborhoods, knowing that there are needs, but also many resources that are doing lots of great things already, but not necessarily working together. And we also believed that working together, we could make a bigger impact in the community. So the city wanted to be that facilitator of those connections. And the slide that you're on now kind of outlines how we started looking at this. For Lakewood, again, it's based on community building. For Lakewood, we did this neighborhood by neighborhood. Our neighborhoods are very unique. We have a population of just over 150,000. So each neighborhood has its own unique set of characteristics, needs, desires, that sort of thing. So we chose to do community engagement in that way. And the definition that we used for a neighborhood was not just the residents, it was the schools, the faith organizations, the businesses, the nonprofits, the neighborhood associations. All those various elements were really the neighborhood. So if you go to the next slide, the implementation of the initiative was done in steps, and I think that was really key for us. And the first step was becoming a partner of Nextdoor.com. I imagine most of you have heard of that as a tool, as a social media tool. And then it's a platform for communities to form around specific geographic boundaries by residents. So we felt like this tool was really important in starting that engagement between neighbors, and the city partnered with Nextdoor.com. And I think real key for us was that our mayor, he held neighborhood-specific meetings to introduce Nextdoor.com, and brought in a representative from Nextdoor.com to do two things, to share with everyone what the site was about. And when I say everyone, we invited nonprofits and schools, libraries, residents, everyone, to talk about what the site was about and how to use it, but also to reinforce that the city, as a partner, could not see those conversations or monitor the information. And that was a concern by some residents, of course. So as a city, we're able to post information on social events, information on construction in the area, park dedications, those kinds of things, library programs that happen in the summer for the youth. We also created posting parameters so that we don't ever overpost, and so that we're not using that site to promote our city programs and services. So I think that was a really good start for us, and we use that for the whole city, not just the police department. When we started looking into this, and this was in 2014, there were 10 sites in Lakewood, and now we have 120 sites operating. And we really think that the promotion we did, the personal promotion, has made that difference. So if you go to the next slide, again, we did this in steps. The next step we took was to form a Lakewood Faith Coalition. We wanted to capitalize on all the good work that we knew the faith organizations were doing in Lakewood. And what we wanted to do is to promote the idea that working together, we could do things better. So the mayor hosted a luncheon of all the faith leaders in Lakewood. We had over 82 people attend that meeting. The mayor talked about the Lakewood Linked concept and acknowledged all the great work that the faith organizations were doing, but suggested that how we might be able to work together and do even greater things. We had lots of enthusiasm, and as a result, a steering committee was formed for the Lakewood Faith Coalition, and it's represented by various different faiths in Lakewood, and they had some very positive outcomes from that, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But acting as a facilitator, the mayor hosted then several additional neighborhood meetings and invited, again, the neighborhood associations, the school principals, the libraries, the neighborhood associations, and the Lakewood Faith Coalition, and introduced them together. And this was also an opportunity to start listening to what our neighborhoods felt were needs, and not just what the city thought. 2 years in now, the Lakewood Faith Coalition has determined that the greatest impact they can make in our Lakewood community is supporting our Title I schools, and we have about 8 now. So each faith organization has adopted one of those schools, and they're working in teams with parents, students, teachers, and community partners to identify the needs and try to work on those. The key here is that our faith organizations are looking beyond their independent religious beliefs and really focusing on what the needs are and how they can help resolve those needs. So you can go to the next slide. The next element in our process then was to do the same thing with the service organizations in Lakewood, and this effort just happened last year in 2016. Again, the mayor hosted a lunch with leaders of all the service organizations, the Rotary, Optimist, Kiwanis, Elks, who all have a passion for helping, and we're doing things in the community already, but not necessarily together. So he again shared the concept of Lakewood Linked. We identified common elements between the clubs, many of them doing the same thing for the same population, and really encouraging them to really talk and see if there wasn't a project they could work together on that would make that greater impact. And that's kind of where we are with them right now. They have identified some areas. They're looking at forming their own steering group now. And the city will then continue to take the role we want, which is to connect them with the other resources and efforts that are happening in the community with the Lakewood Faith Coalition, the schools, and so forth. So you can go to the next slide. Our final steps in this whole process then are going to be working with business associations and our nonprofits. Businesses and nonprofits partnerships are actually happening naturally with all the community efforts. There's been so much synergy that they've been pulled in already, but there are certainly businesses that may be unaware of this and nonprofits. So we will be taking that next step probably later this year, to connect in with them. So on the next slide, you'll see there was some early successes. While all this was happening and research and education was happening on what the needs were by these community groups, we had some early successes as people heard about it. And I've got that on the slide, but you'll see that we had a local paint store that was so motivated that they wanted to provide paint to residents for graffiti cleanup. And some other opportunities which you'll see here. We have local hardware store that provided workshops and supplied discounts to residents participating in sustainable neighborhood programs that we have at the city. Our Lakewood Faith Coalition set up food pantries and a process for maintaining those, and so forth. So we had some early successes. But on the next several slides, I've sort of highlighted three bigger projects that really are great examples of the collaborative spirit that we've seen in the community. First, the Head Start preschool program. They wanted an outdoor classroom, and by working together, that happened. And you can see that in the second slide after this, you'll see what the project looks like. But we had hardware stores, lumber stores, nurseries. We had Colorado Construction Institute that trained at-risk youth a trade, and they built sheds. And there were a couple of grants done that the Lakewood helped with, and service organizations. So by working together, they got a wonderful project. And I know I'm running out of time, so let me run through the next two real quick. One other great project was the Foothills Field of Dreams. This was actually the renovation of a play yard at a local school. What's key here is it was the church up the hill that saw the need, a parcel of land that could not be used for play at all. He organized an effort with neighbors, parents, teachers, businesses. Some grants were done, and as a result, this renovation has made a huge difference on the neighborhood at large. And residents are hosting picnics and joining in school festivals. Parents seem to be more engaged, and it's really become a hub for the area. And the last project, as an example, is at Green Mountain Elementary School. Very, very similar project, where the whole community and all the elements came together to make it work. So as I end this, I think we continue to develop ways to encourage engagement, but taking it step by step has really made the difference for us. And what is important to say is that the city took only the initial step to encourage partnerships and make some connections, but it's really the synergy among the community elements that made these projects happen. So there's a lot of passion in the community, and we just try to tap into that. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. And since we only have a minute till the top of the hour, if you do have any questions for Mary, feel free to email me and we can get those answered for you. I do want to apologize. This is the first time we have used this webinar technology, so it seems like the intro wasn't heard by everyone, but just want to say thank you again for joining, and we really feel like these three presentations kind of sum up the different aspects of inclusive civic engagement that we're going to be highlighting in the 2018 application. And so again, Seattle really talking about institutional racism and those barriers to engagement, Dubuque and how you can use engagement within local government to have civic engagement throughout the community, and then finally Lakewood using local government as the convening role to help activate engagement throughout the community. So again, I just want to say thank you to our three presenters, and look for the follow-up email with more resources from them, and also an invitation to our webinars next month. March, we're going to be focusing on youth initiatives. So you'll see on March 14th, we're going to have a webinar about positive relationships with youth and law enforcement. And then later on in the month, we will have one on how to create spaces for youth to lead their own initiatives. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and you'll receive a follow-up email soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.